Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Today we'll be discussing what has been happening in the last week in the federal contractor community. Today we've invited Jeremy Mancheski, the CEO of Outsolve, to break it all down for us. Jeremy, what happened last Tuesday?
A lot, actually. Been working in federal contractor compliance for 30 plus years, and I would say you had about 30 years worth of change backed up into a 4 or 5 day period last week. Started off with an inauguration on Martin Luther King Day, by the way, that had some interesting outcomes. Of course, a lot of regulatory change, executive orders, anti-DEI sentiment. Think of this past week as a whole bunch of headlines without a lot of story. So we started out the week with an anti-DEI sentiment, and by Tuesday evening we rescinded Executive Order 11246. So let's break that down for a second. What is Executive Order 11246? Well, let's go all the way back to President Johnson. Before I was born, President Johnson, in response to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, which is going to become relevant again here very soon, that executive order provided for affirmative action, non-discrimination, and employment for federal contractors. Okay, well, that executive order was rescinded. So what does that mean? Well, that means that as of Tuesday evening, company can no longer take affirmative action. Now let's distinguish affirmative action and non-discrimination and DEI. Three very, very different things that, frankly, I don't think this administration understands, but the contractor community must. First of all, DEI. That is the voluntary efforts that a company undertakes to ensure an equitable and inclusive workforce. There's no law behind DEI that mandates it. Affirmative action. That's a buzzword. In fact, a trigger word clearly for this administration, where the contractor community, many of you, are clearly focused on attracting and retaining and motivating, in this case, minorities and women, theoretically to right some past wrong. The executive order suggested that via an affirmative action plan. Now, that affirmative action plan covers minorities and women. That's Executive Order 11246. VEVRAA, Vietnam-Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act. That's for veterans. And Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, individuals with disabilities. By the way, VEVRAA and 503 still exist. But the executive order discussing affirmative action was rescinded. Now, non-discrimination in employment, something very, very different entirely. Non-discrimination in employment is what you've always had to monitor, what you've always had to maintain, believe it or not, what the executive order has always suggested, and what OFCCP, the monitoring agency, has always enforced. So when you ran adverse impact analyses, Vickie, how many adverse impact analyses do you think you've run in your career?
Oh, gosh. So many.
Thousands.
Yeah, right.
Thousands and thousands.
Right, yeah.
And in the last 15 years, did you not consider whites or males in your analyses?
No, there was a time when it was only minorities and women, but more recently, in the recent years, we're now looking at every race, every gender. You know, who is the favored group? Who is impacted? And absolutely, whites and males could be the impacted group. So we're now looking at it. In the last few years, OFCCP has required companies to look at all races to make sure there isn't discrimination in any aspect of employment.
How much time have you spent in the last week explaining the difference between Title VII and the executive order?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I've been doing last week. I've explained a lot to our clients that when you're thinking of Title VII, there is the non-discrimination clauses. We cannot discriminate against protected characteristics. The executive order had that as well. I always say it's like two prongs. It had the first prong was you cannot discriminate. It was almost verbatim, just like Title VII. But then it had the second prong of the positive efforts, the advancing and employing minorities and women. We took away the positive efforts, the outreach, that part of it, but the non-discrimination still exists. And to your point, the private sector has been following Title VII all this time. So if anything, we're just aligning the federal contractor community with the private sector, what they've already been doing and monitoring.
So last week was a big week. Started out, like we say, on Martin Luther King Day, no DEI. By Tuesday, we had gotten rid of the executive order. By Friday, OFCCP was effectively declawed.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It means that if you have an open compliance evaluation, it's no longer open. In fact, you should be getting a notice, and we've seen some already that have come through. Your audits are closed. The 503 and VEVRAA regulations are in abeyance. Doesn't mean you don't have to comply. It means that OFCCP can enforce. So I think breaking this down a bit, you have a few things to consider. First of all, what is OFCCP now? No one knows. One of a few things could happen. It'll be shuttered, quite possibly. It'll be refocused, maybe as an anti-DEI arm. Who knows? Doesn't really matter. The regulations and the laws that you need to be concerned about still really exist. 503 and VEVRAA, as well as Title VII. If you look at the new Trump executive order, it eliminates affirmative action. It also, if you go on and read it carefully, it suggests that a company will have to verify non-discrimination in employment within their workforce. How are we going to do that? It's not clear. Remember, headline, no story. It suggests that for 90 days, you can do what you were doing before. So even though affirmative action in employment was rescinded for minorities and women with the rescinding of Executive Order 11246, for 90 days you can still do it. Within 120 days, there is expected some new regulatory vehicle guidance, etc. So, Vickie, what are you telling customers right now?
For right now, I think you should, while we're under this umbrella, while we're protected under the 90 days, let's complete if you have an expired plan, let's get a current plan in place so that you have that in your back pocket. I know a lot of clients have state requests that they still have to abide by for affirmative action reasons. So let's get that while we're protected under the 90 days. And then we should start potentially looking at trainings, policies, words that may have diversity and inclusion to make sure we start pulling things back. And then we wait to see what the new requirements are.
There'll need to be some attestation that illegal DEI has been removed from your business. That's clear. The executive order, 11246, we know is the past. We've spent a lot of time, Vickie, myself, Patrick Savoy, and others here, we've spent a lot of time in the last week trying to reframe what we think that'll look like. You still have exposure. And in fact, I would argue that you have exposure from a broader sector of potential litigants than you did just a week ago. Let's think about this. A week ago, you had a fairly prescriptive process with OFCCP. You do your plan, maybe you get an audit, we work through it, and we've spent a lot of years doing that. Now, you're going to have the political turmoil and upheaval of the entire federal contractor community, the government community, and the private sector wondering how this all fits together. So we know we don't have OFCCP. We know there's all these different government agencies. Who knows who's going to be involved? But now you're going to have civil rights groups, plaintiffs, and who knows what else. I mean, there's questions about False Claims Act, concerns whether a company could have responsibilities in who knows what other laws are out there. Best guidance, Vickie, right now for your customers. Continue on. Within 120 days, we're hoping to have some additional guidance from the federal government. I'm actually going this week to meet with several folks from government agencies, lawyers, other folks in our space to try to make some recommendations on what we think this should look like. Again, lots of headline, not a lot of story. And we think there's a story to be written because every one of our customers still has significant and, in fact, increased risk over what they had before.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone is appreciative of just needing some guidance because it's been a busy week. So just as a recap, everyone, please stay in touch with your consultants. We know the Executive Order 11246 has been rescinded, but we know for the next 90 days, we're still able to complete your affirmative action plans. There's more to come in the next 120 days, so make sure you're subscribed to our Outsolve blog to stay in touch with all the latest and greatest. Thanks so much.